it's Jessie from b.a.r.e Flower Farm. Today, I want to talk about an alternative form to composting. Now, this is a video for you if you are a small scale grower or if you are a hobbyist gardener and you want to reuse your food waste besides diverting them from the landfill, but to reuse them to feed your soil life. This was the exact challenge I had when I lived in a townhouse. So back in 2019, we lived in a townhouse. I had started growing vegetables and I had this challenge of, I know my food waste can really fertilize and feed that soil microbiome, but how do I do it, especially if I don't have enough space? So this video is for you if you are in that constraint or if you don't have the machinery to make compost at a large scale. So I'm going to talk everything about what is this method. It's actually called Bokashi, so we will go into details. We'll talk about how it's different from traditional composting, talk about things like cost, what about rodents, how do I do it in the winter, and of course, last but not least, the most important part, the impact on soil health. So if you're new to my channel, I am a second-year flower farmer in Zone 6B in New Jersey. I typically make videos focusing on the business side of things, but one of the things that's really important to me is sustainability, and it's the reason why I got into flower farming. I realized the impact that flowers have on our local ecosystems, and basically what I've been trying to do is build my soil life and soil health in my field, and these food scraps have been very, very important for that. So if this video is helpful for you, please consider subscribing and liking it. And I also now have a Patreon where I have articles that will accompany videos like this to go into detail, to have it in written form, and of course to source the sources that I use to make videos like this. So for $5 a month, you can have access to ungated content like that, and I will put a link below for the Patreon, but also for an example of a blog article that will accompany a video like this. So let's get started. What exactly is Bokashi? Simply put, Bokashi is a Japanese method that essentially pickles your food waste. It is an anaerobic process, which means it does not require oxygen. It actually can't have oxygen or else it will facilitate rot. But essentially what you do is you take your food waste, you put it in a double-tiered bucket system, which I will explain further. You spread this bran on there, and that facilitates that pickling. And the reason why this pickling concept is important to understand is because, one, it takes out the water content out of the food, it helps break down the food, and that all means that by the time you end up burying the food, which is weeks to months later, that food is already well on its way to decomposing. So the process is you put all your food scraps in a bucket, you put the bran on top of the food scraps as you continue to layer it. And then when you're finally done, you seal the lid on there. And when I say when you're finally done, it means when you finally fill the bucket, you seal the lid on top, and then you leave it aside for about 14 days. And in that 14 days, everything is going to continue to pickle. And then when you're done with that 14 days, you dig a trench about 12 inches deep. You bury that Bokashi food waste in there, you cover it, you can direct seed directly on top of it then, or you can wait about 10 to 14 days before you put transplants on there. And in that 10 to 14 days, the food is going to continue breaking down, and even when you put transplants on there, the food is going to break down even further. I've done experiments in the past where I look and I re-dig up that soil, and that food is gone within about a month. It's pretty incredible. There's some things that still remain, like eggshells, like avocado skins, but a lot of the other stuff, especially like lettuce leaves or stalks, all of that is gone within a month. So it's pretty incredible how quickly this process works. So let's first talk a little bit about how this is different from traditional composting before I go into the equipment that you need for this. So it's different from traditional composting in the sense that, one, it is anaerobic. Traditional composting is aerobic. It absolutely needs oxygen, and this is a constraint of composting for most people. So even if you had the space at a certain scale, it becomes really difficult to turn the compost. A lot of people are also really intimidated by the carbon and nitrogen ratio that you need to maintain. Even though you can ballpark a lot of that, it's sometimes intimidating to have to figure out what to do. But then on top of that, you need to constantly be turning that pot pile so that you can incorporate oxygen in there for composting to do its work. Now, we just got a tractor, which made this easier to do for the traditional composting method. But without something like a tractor, if you continue piling on food waste and other stuff, it becomes really difficult to turn it manually. So that's why Bokashi is awesome, because there's absolutely no turning. There's really no manual labor involved outside of putting the food waste into the buckets and then carrying that bucket to wherever it is, digging that trench and putting the food waste in there. So that's the first difference, anaerobic versus aerobic process. The second difference is that the Bokashi waste is buried into the soil versus traditional composting. You just have that soil turn into compost and you can apply it onto the soil. So for someone who's trying to practice regenerative practices, the biggest elephant in the room is that, well, technically you are disturbing the soil by burying the food in there. So it's a form of mechanical tillage. But for me, it has always been a net benefit in my view, especially where I am right now, where a lot of my field needs to get amended. I cannot create Bokashi waste fast enough to do it. So that kind of mechanical tillage, in my view, is totally worth it because I'm attracting a lot of earthworms after I bury it. And there is a significant physical difference that I can see in the soil after I do this in a certain area. So, third difference is there's this question of, does Bokashi waste turn into humus, which is the ultimate byproduct that you're looking for from a good compost. Now, there's been a lot of research studies that basically haven't concluded as to when it happens. So my understanding is that it does eventually happen. Bokashi is a much faster process than composting. Traditional composting takes months. Unless if you're doing something like hot composting, which is a real science. Traditional composting takes months. Bokashi can literally take weeks depending on how quickly you fill the bucket. And assuming you can fill the bucket within, a few weeks and then you let it sit for another couple of weeks, you can bury your food scraps within a month or two. So within that month or two, even though that food is going to disappear in the soil, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's broken down to the point where it becomes humus. Now, for me, it's almost irrelevant because of the impact on soil health it has. So it is still a benefit to the soil health. I think this is just more for people who are trying to compare between, should I compost or should I Bokashi? And I think at the end, you'll see when I wrap this video up why there could be an argument to doing both depending on your situation. So now let's talk about the equipment that you're gonna need. I've seen setups that are kits for you that range from like $60 to $120. They make the setup look a lot nicer. So we have a very non-glorified setup. And we use these handy 5-gallon buckets that you can get at your local hardware store. So we have a ton from Lowe's, Home Depot. These buckets typically, I think, range maybe $6 now. They've gone up a little bit in price, but what we do is we get 2 of these. So the first bucket, we drill holes on the bottom. So you see the holes there? And then we layer this bucket right on top of a second bucket with no holes. So that second bucket captures any of the liquid that flows through these holes. And so you want to make sure you have enough holes and that the holes are somewhat big enough so that the water or the pickled water from the food waste can trickle through. And I would say that a bucket like this for a household of 2 adults takes roughly about a month and a half to 2 months for us to fill up. So depending on your household size, depending on how often you cook, we basically cook 6 days of the week. We sometimes go out for that 1 extra day, or we have enough leftovers where we don't cook for that 1 extra day. But that's how long it takes for us to fill this. So we are a pretty cooking heavy kind of household. And so I'm able to generate a full bucket every, we'll call it 2 months. And I usually have 2 pairs of these buckets so that when one is pickling, the other is empty and I can automatically put food waste in there. Now, what we do is we keep our food waste in what we call these hotel pans. And so you can keep them in like a small bucket. It doesn't matter where you house it. The point is that we're not constantly going outside to fill the bucket. We do it every maybe like 2 days or so when the 2 hotel compost buckets are full. We put it in here, and every time I dump in one of those buckets of food waste, I put in the microbial bran. So this is the Bokashi brand. This brand is close to 3 years old now. It still clearly works. We got a big bag off of Amazon. I will link it in the description below, but it lasts for a really long time. And I think a bag like this goes for about $30 right now. So you can make your own brand. I just don't see the point in doing it since it's relatively cheap. It's very accessible. And this brand is inoculated with lactobacilli, I think is the name of it. But that is really what helps break down the food. So you can touch it. It has this like very sweet fermenty smell. So every single time I have a layer of food, I sprinkle this on there, and then I put another layer of food, sprinkle it on there, and then usually I cap it off with our espresso grinds because that's very, very fine, thin material. And so that way, before I put a plate on it to fully make sure that it's smushed down and as much of the air is out as possible, I feel like the espresso grinds help make sure there's that like layer in between that and the plate so that as little oxygen as possible gets in. And that is really important in Bokashi, is that you try to minimize the amount of oxygen that goes in. So obviously every single time you lift up the lid, you're gonna have oxygen going in. That's totally fine. You just don't want lots of air pockets in that, especially if it's gonna be sitting for a long period of time. All in all, if you do the math, it's a really simple and cheap setup. 2 buckets. Now we'll call it $12 with the lid, $3. That's $15 total for the bucket. Plus brand that's gonna last you for a while. The brand's $30. So we're looking at $45 for over a year to 2 years worth of the ability to do this alternative form of composting. And then if you want to add up another pair of buckets, another $15, it's, in my view, it's really reasonable, especially given the amount of money you're going to save on buying fertilizer and, the effort of going out to buy that. So it's a really cheap way of alternative composting is the point that I'm trying to make. So let's talk about what food scraps go in there. So hypothetically, you can compost animal products. We stick to non-animal products with the exception of eggshells. So we compost our vegetable scraps, use tea leaves, use coffee grinds, and then the eggshells. We used to not eat as much meat as we do now, to be honest. But we have a dog. So our dog eats a lot of the meat scraps. He obviously doesn't eat the bones. So the bones are really the only ones or the only things in our food scrap pile that go into landfill. I have actually tried burying bones before, and it does decompose over time, especially if you put that Bokashi brand on there. But I find that a lot of animals will be attracted to it and want to dig it up. So that brings me to my next topic, which is what about rodents? This is a common fear that people have. So for whatever reason, rodents are less attracted to food that has been Bokashi'd or pickled. There is a certain smell that the food has. It's, I'm gonna say that while it's not my favorite smell, it is not a bad smell. It's got this like sweet pickled fermenty scent. It's really hard to describe, but it's not foul by any means. It's just like, it smells almost like pickles, but a different kind of pickle. So animals are not attracted to that. I've buried Bokashi waste in my townhouse setting. So obviously no fenced area, but also low traffic for deer and all that stuff, but relatively high traffic for rodents. And I've never had any issues of an animal digging it back up. And then in my fenced in area in the back here, I've also never had any issues with smaller rodents that could get through that fence. So the key here is that you are burying it at least 8 inches deep. You're supposed to bury it like 12 inches. I typically do 8 to 10 and I can get away with it. And then the other key is that you are allowing that food to fully pickle and ferment before you bury it, because if you don't, then obviously it hasn't decomposed and it hasn't gotten that fermented smell on there. So I think then you do risk rodents coming in to potentially dig it up. Bokashi works really well when the temperature is warm outside. So I'm going to say parts of spring, definitely the summer, parts of fall. So what about the cooler times, or if you live in an environment where it's freezing for half the year? We bring our Bokashi buckets indoors, and this is a testament to the smell. It's good. It's not offensive by any means, and so we don't have any problem putting it indoors. We usually set it aside, and the bucket is contained because there is a lid on there, and we're able to keep it pretty clean. Our dog is curious about it but never tries to eat it, so we find that in the winter, you can keep it in the garage, or you can keep it our garage and our kitchen are not necessarily that close to each other, so we just keep it in the corner by the kitchen, and it stays it's hard to see, and it makes it a lot more convenient for us to do it. And then in the summer or the warmer months, we keep it outside on our back patio, and that has direct access to the kitchen, so it's even more convenient for us to just step outside, bring the buckets and the bran, spread it on top, and then we're done with it. So it makes it really easy from a storage perspective because it doesn't take a lot of space. The footprint is literally the footprint of a bucket and the bag for the bran. All right, so here's the most important part of the video. What is the difference on the soil? Now, I can talk about my personal experience, but there's also scientific studies. So my post that I will have in the link below and in my Patreon cites 3 separate studies. And there have been a lot of studies done on Bokashi because of the difficulty in traditional composting in a lot of developing countries. So a lot of these studies are actually done in areas where people may not have access to machinery. These are small scale farms. And so they're trying to use natural inputs in order to boost their productivity. So there was a study that showed that for tomatoes, the yield was not only better, but there was also more leaf production. It overall just showed a significant boost in tomato leaves and yield because of Bokashi. Similar studies were done on soybeans, as well as cilantro, celery. I've cited those studies in the links, but if you just Google Bokashi impact on soil health, you'll start seeing a lot more studies being done. Now, Bokashi in the grand scheme is not as widely known as other forms of composting. I think it's starting to gain momentum. So there are smaller scale studies, but it's not, in my view, as heavily researched as it could be, given how easy it is to do. So in my personal experience, I have seen such a significant difference. So the first significant difference is I lived in a townhouse, which was a new build. So what that meant was that the soil around the townhouse was trucked in construction fill. It's not soil. And we had about where our back patio wasn't graded correctly, and so it would flood. In fact, our first floor had a little bit of water. So I was like a maniac, basically burying as much Bokashi waste in that area as possible to get it to sponge up water. And so I can't tell if that's what made the difference. Obviously, there was a bit of regrading, but when I dug up that soil months later, it was rich, it was black. I was planting flowers in there and it looked really, really beautiful. The second thing is that we would also bury our food scraps in our smart pot containers. So I would grow in 7 to 10 to 12 gallon pots. I would bury the food scraps in there and it looked amazing. It looked so great that we made it a priority to truck over all of that soil from our townhouse to our new house. And that's what I used to fill my raised beds with. Today, whenever I create a new raised bed or I'm creating, or I'm putting in like a new bed and I need to fill it with material, Bokashi is always one of those inputs. I put a layer in, I put some crappy soil. So usually that's like top soil that we get when we're like seeding our grass, right? We'll get like yards of that. And that is not high quality material. That is almost like fill in some ways. And for the purposes of grass seeding, it works. But if you're trying to grow intensive crops like vegetables or even get long seasons of flushes of flowers, that's not sufficient, but you can amend it with something like Bokashi to make it better. Every single time when I amend with Bokashi, I see a lot of earthworms in that area. And it is just amazing how quickly that transformation is. And that is the biggest appeal to me about Bokashi, which is that within a relatively short period of time, we're talking about a couple of months, you can start seeing a transformation in your soil. When you dig that Bokashi and you fill that layer, you go back to it in 2 months, you will literally see a layer of black, of organic matter that has started to form. So if you repeatedly do that in the same area, you're going to see a lot more organic matter. And I think there is a point where you probably want to stop doing it because then you're disrupting the soil aggregates and we get into tilling mechanics and why one shouldn't be tilling repeatedly over time. But if you're starting a new space and you don't have great soil in that space, Bokashi is something that you should seriously consider if you cannot do traditional composting. So that leads me to my conclusion. Who is Bokashi right for? It's a no-brainer for people who don't have space. It's a no-brainer for people who don't have equipment, like a tractor to be able to turn traditional compost. But now that we have a tractor, I am still doing Bokashi. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, even though we have the space to compost, we haven't built a composting section to keep the deer and the rodents out. So for that reason, Bokashi is still easy for us to implement. And the second reason is because unless if I'm gonna do hot composting, I don't necessarily always want to wait for that composting to finish for me to improve my soil health. So I kind of take this two-prong approach where our food waste goes into Bokashi and I am mending the soil that way. And all of the weeds, all of the spent blooms I have go into that traditional composting pile, where then we're turning it with a tractor and we're using that soil actually for my lily bulbs. So I grow lilies in crates and we use that compost to grow the lilies. And afterwards, that compost sometimes is then dumped onto the bed area, or sometimes I might just apply that compost as a supplement compost mulch on top of my beds. So there is use for both. In a space like mine, which is 40 by 90 feet, I can't get enough of either. So what I love about incorporating the food scraps is that there is a certain level of diversity in those food scraps that you're never going to get from weeds and whatever is out in your yard alone, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize the amount of diversity that you're putting into things like compost in order to create the best kind of output possible. So I'm finding that this combination right now is working for me, and I'm getting to a point where I'm actually asking people to give me their food waste so that I can Bokashi it and expedite this process. So I hope this video is helpful for you, especially if you're someone who has been wanting to reuse your food waste. One of the things that I think people don't really realize until they get really into gardening or farming is that it's really hard to trust the type of compost that you're getting. It's hard to trust that you're getting quality compost, especially if you're trying to get it in big quantities. If you're buying it from the bag, there are certain brands that I would gravitate towards, but if you're buying it by the truckload, you have no idea if that compost, like municipality compost, had herbicides or some side sprayed on top of it. And there are a lot of heartbreaking stories of people getting compost by the truckfuls and that compost not being aged enough or having some sort of herbicide in there that ends up ruining their crop. So it's been one of those things where I prioritize because I know what goes into my food scraps. I know what weeds I have out there, right? So if I'm able to control that very important input of amending and fertilizing, then that is a really big unknown controllable or an unknown factor that I'm making somewhat within my control. The other argument that some people have is how do you know what you're buying in terms of food is not being sprayed and all that stuff. You know, we grow a lot of our own food during the summer. Obviously, there are times where we buy organic and non-organic, but for the most part, that kind of stuff has a lot less of an impact on the quality of your compost versus getting grass clippings that have been sprayed by some sort of herbicide. So just all things for you to keep in mind. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Consider subscribing, liking this video, and even joining my Patreon. And I will see you in the next video.